good evening and welcome to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host for this program. Our guest tonight is John Knutson, and I'm excited to have John on the program. He's a revert to the faith, but he also works for the Arlington Diocese in the new evangelization and adult formation, and I'm excited to talk about that. And it's good to have a guest, particularly who's not only committed to evangelization, but working hard in the diocese to help awaken our need to reach out in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ and for His church. And so welcome to the program. And John, welcome to The Journey Home. It's good to have you to the program. Look forward to hearing your story. And then hopefully we'll have time toward the end of the program to talk about your work.
Sure.
All right, so let me get out of the way and invite you to go way back and let's start us on the journey.
Okay. Well, you probably know G.K. Chesterton famously said that there are two ways to get back home. One is to stay there, the other is to travel around the world until you come back to the same place. So that was very much my story. I was born and raised in Northern California. A Catholic family. I was the youngest of 5 children. My parents have always been Catholic, so that was just part of our life. We went to Mass every Sunday as a family. But I really never learned the faith. My parents, like so many others then as now, relied on the parish for religious education for the children. And it was just that's how it had been for them when they were growing up. And of course the difference between the 1930s and the 1940s and the 1970s and early 80s when I was growing up is a big difference. So it was not really part of our home life in any major way other than going to Sunday Mass. I don't recall that we ever talked much about the faith or prayed before meals, that sort of thing. So
you didn't even do the generic Catholic before meal prayer as a family?
Not that I remember.
Huh.
No, and I asked my siblings, and they don't remember it either. And as I said, I don't blame my parents for that. There was a lot going on in the family then, and it's just how it was. So, and then I started out going to the parish school as a child, but then on the advice of a religious sister who worked in the parish and the school, my parents pulled me out of the parish school. So from the age of 6 or 7 on, I went to public schools. And I was enrolled in
The
CCD.
sister asked your parents to get you
Yeah,
out of
my
there.
brother, my next brother up and I, we were both pulled out, and it's a long story. So I was enrolled in CCD at the parish, but as often as not, when the car drove around the corner after my mom dropped me off, I would just run to a friend's house. I wouldn't even go most of the time. So that's how it was. I was an altar boy, though, as an older child. And so by the time I was about 12, I just noticed one Sunday that my parents weren't making me go to Mass with them anymore. My oldest siblings were out of the house by then, off to college. And it was very easy just to slip away, I didn't know much to begin with, so I just quietly slipped away. There was no fanfare, no soapbox moment, anything like that.
So the question of God or any belief in God just really
didn't interest me in the least. And that, my parents, I think, took a very hands-off approach to it all because they probably could see at that time that I was becoming more resistant, heading into my rebellious teenage years. And had they pushed, I might have gone the other way. So I'm sure if I had shown an interest, they would have been delighted to talk about it. But that's where I was at the time. So I went into high school, indifferent, certainly indifferent. My interests there were music. I taught myself how to play the bass guitar when I was 14, 15. So that was a real passion for me. That's what I wanted to do, was be a rock star. And my other passion, of course, was girls at that age, coming into my teenage years. There was I remember one day when I was in high school, I was walking home, and there was a group of Christians out on the corner handing out Bibles to the kids as they passed. And just to give you an example of where I was at that time, I just quietly, without a word, took one, and as I walked away, just tore out the pages and just let them fall into the street. So I was indifferent, I would say agnostic, but definitely gravitating towards something more strident.
Yeah, to tear out the pages of the Bible said that underneath you there was a a rejection,
Yeah.
at least, if
Yeah.
not an anger.
Yes, and I think it had as much to do with rebellion against my parents in general, their politics, their religion, whatever was associated with them, I think, in those years.
Well,
It was troubling for me. But my mom prayed for me all the time, and so I had no interest in school at all. I could have been an A student, but was very much a C student, drove my teachers crazy for that reason, because they knew I could be much more than I was. But I just wasn't interested. I really didn't care. I had no intention of going on to college when I graduated, because as I say, I wanted to be a rock star. I wanted to go in the music business. That's what I wanted to do. So when I graduated, I just worked odd jobs full time and played in the band on weekends, and that was an eye-opening experience for me. I mean, just to play in these full clubs, hear the applause of the people there, and that was intoxicating for me, really. So that's what I wanted to do. Well, within a couple of years, I wisened up. I got tired of people asking me, when are you going to go back to school? So I just started to take a few classes at the community college and met some teachers that I really liked and who really inspired me. And I realized that, I did have an interest in this, history in particular. So I went on to college there in my hometown and was a history major. And that's where I was in those years, not really interested in matters of God or faith at all. And
nobody at all talking to you to come back? No one trying to evangelize you?
Not in the least.
Wow.
No,
Okay.
not in the least. I was very much in and of the world and happy to be there. But as you say, unsettled. Also, I wouldn't have called myself a happy and content kid at that age. So it was in college that the first real crisis came. My oldest brother was living in New York at the time. He was a graduate of the Juilliard School, and he was a stage actor. He was trying to make it as a stage actor there. Well, he came home from Christmas, for Christmas from New York one year, and told the family that he had tested positive for the HIV virus. So that was an earthquake in the family. Didn't change at all how I felt about him. He and I had never been really close, but we had a special bond from the time I was a child. So it was terrible news, of course, but it didn't change anything about the way I felt about him.
Yeah.
Well, before too long, he had to make a decision as he began to get sicker. Was he going to stay in New York or come back to California to be around his family? So he chose to come back. So he moved back home. My parents converted a spare bedroom into a hospice, basically. And my brother and my father in particular really stepped up and took unbelievable care of him. My other brother ended up going on to become a nurse because of the experience. And so, but I just ran from the whole experience. I didn't want to face it at all. I spent as much time out of the house as I could. I didn't want to deal with the whole question of what was happening to him.
Because it wasn't just the disease, it was a lifestyle.
Sure.
And your family dealt with that at all? Was that like
you
said,
they did. I mean, it was very hard, of course, for my parents in particular, but they never, I mean, as I say, they really stepped up. It was their son, and he was our brother. We loved him dearly, so. So eventually, it didn't take too long. He finally grew very, very ill, and then he died right there in the back bedroom of the house with all of us standing around his bedside. And I will never forget the night. Once he finally did pass away, I remember kneeling on the floor and placing my head on the pillow next to his and just looking him straight in the face. And I realized he's gone. Now, whatever it was that made him was not there anymore. And it was a strangely unemotional experience for me, really. But at the time, I remember choosing atheism. I just decided right then and there I didn't believe in God. There couldn't be a God. This is absurd. Life is absurd. This can't have a meaning. This can't have a point. So I really threw in my lot there.
And that's interesting, because then how would you have described what was missing when he...
That's a very good question. I wasn't there yet.
Yeah, okay. So, yeah, all right.
Yeah. So from then on, I kept on at college. I went back to my studies. I took a philosophy class in existentialism. I loved it, and I started reading a lot. Bertrand Russell, his essays against religion, and the plays of Samuel Beckett really appealed to me. So I was reading, immersing myself sort of in atheist literature, agnostic literature, because I felt it gave me a certain justification for my beliefs. And I became more angrier about the whole thing. I became more militant about my atheism in that period. I was arrogant, thought I knew a lot more than I did. My mother would sometimes gently remind me, you need God in your life. So my parents basically stayed out of it. But my mother prayed for me, I know, intensely in all those years. But I, in return, mocked her faith, even tried to undermine it in some ways. So she has played the role of St. Monica in my life. No doubt that the reason I'm sitting in this chair now has a lot to do with her prayers, but that's where I was at that time. And the curious thing, though, is that there, as you alluded to earlier, there were areas of my heart that were unsettled, that were unresolved in all of this. Just to give you a few examples, I was still, even in the years wearing around my neck a crucifix medal that the bishop had given me as an altar boy.
Wow.
I still had the crucifix that was given to me for my first communion hanging on my wall. Mother Teresa, strangely, always played a role in my life, because my mother had just loved her, had a great devotion to her and the work that she was doing. And sometimes for Christmas, all of us kids would get a book of her meditations or sayings from my mom for Christmas. And I was, even though I was tracking very much toward atheism, I was fascinated by and drawn to the example of Mother Teresa. There was something very authentic there, and that's what I prized above all else, was authenticity. Whatever else I might have thought of her beliefs, I couldn't argue with the beauty of her life and what she was doing. So she was another figure.
Our guest is John Knutson. Authenticity. Well, what is authenticity for an atheist?
That's a very good question. I guess at the time I would have described it as embracing life, living it to the full. Now she was doing it for a very different reason, of course. And as I say, I wasn't there yet, but there was something there that drew me to her. And that was thanks to my mother's influence. And it's interesting, just a side note, a family detail, that my mother was born and raised in San Francisco, and her grandparents, their home ended up falling into the other owner's hands over the years. Well, eventually a man who owned it donated it to the Missionaries of Charity. He gave it personally to Mother Teresa, and she came out and created an AIDS hospice in that house. They called it the House of Bread. So she's always been there, in one way or another in our family.
But that crucifix on the wall, or what was it jewelry? Was it just?
It was a very simple.
Just there, but I mean, for you at the time, it was just a part of the landscape of your room. You know what I mean?
Well,
did you see it, or just were blind?
I did. I mean, I saw it enough not to take it down. What it meant to me, I don't know. Linked to my childhood, I really couldn't say what it was. And the other thing that happened in college is I spent a summer in Rome. At this time I had a passion for ancient history, Greek and Roman history in particular. So I had the opportunity to go on a travel study program to Rome, which I leapt at. I mean, who doesn't want to go walk among the ruins where the Caesars were and that sort of thing. And that's what I wanted to do. I decided at that time I wanted to go on and get a doctorate in ancient history and teach at the college level. So I went off to Rome, and I spent most of my time, of course, among the ruins and seeing those sites. But of course, we went to the other sites as well. And I was very moved by St. Peter's Basilica. I remember walking in there and just being in awe of the place, looking around and thinking, the faith that went into the building of this, whatever you may think about it, is the faith that went into the construction of this, and which is revealed in everything around you, was very striking to me. And I gravitated in particular toward Michelangelo's Pietà, his statue of the Blessed Mother holding the dead body of Jesus, and even shed a tear while standing there, while looking at it. So I described this experience in a postcard home to my parents, and it made my mother very hopeful that something was happening there, but maybe there was, but I wasn't aware of it at the time.
Seeds are being planted, like that crucifix on the wall,
absolutely.
and those seeds are still there.
Yeah.
And,
Well, and you know, I had been given the great gift of being brought to baptism when I was 3 weeks old,
Right.
so the grace is there.
right.
I'm sure that was part of it as well. So as I say, I wanted to go on to grad school and get a doctorate, so I went off to the University of St. Andrews in Scotland.
Wow.
They have a very good ancient history department, so I packed my bags and went over there after graduating. And
Are you still dragging your bass guitar with you all this time?
I did not bring it to Scotland, no. No, I was still very interested, loved to play, but the rock star piece of it was falling by the wayside growing up, I guess. So I went there, and I lived in a dorm with a lot of other graduate students from all over the world. And there were two in particular who immediately caught my attention. One was an older man from Nigeria. He was a physician, and he was there doing a doctorate in the School of Divinity. And I found out that he was a Christian. I don't know what kind. We never really talked about it. He was just a delightful man. He radiated joy, just his presence. He was always dressed very formally. And I used to love to sit in the common room or in the dining hall and just talk to him about life and things like that. We never talked about God. We never talked about the faith. I mean, he would mention God in passing. It was so much part of his life. But I was just very impressed that here was a Christian man who was so joyful. I had never met anybody that joyful in my life. There's something very attractive about that. And the other was a young woman from Australia who was doing a doctorate in philosophy. And she was there for a couple of years doing some research. She was a non-denominational Christian, but very committed, the daughter of a Protestant minister back in Australia. And she had what I can only now describe as a very deep purity of heart. She had a very deep faith, a simple faith. She was one of those people who just has a childlike wonder about life and the world, and she could truly find the universe in a grain of sand. And that fascinated me because I had never experienced that. I'd never met anybody like that in my life. And so it was with her, for the first time in my life, that I started to talk about God and matters of life, the big questions, in a way that did not make me defensive and hostile, sort of trying to attack the other person or undermine their beliefs. We just talked. And that was a very important thing for me, to start to see the rational basis.
Because that environment, I'm assuming, would have been Presbyterian, Scottish Presbyterian.
Yeah, there was a small
Calvinist.
Catholic.
I mean, that's even that school of theology there, I would assume.
Yeah, I would guess so, yeah.
Right.
I wasn't interested in that at the time, so I didn't know, but that's probably correct.
But it wasn't a strong part of the education you were getting there. Okay.
No, not at all.
All right.
Yeah. So for my birthday that first year, this Australian friend of mine gave me 2 books by C.S. Lewis. She gave me Mere Christianity and The Screwtape Letters, which I did not read. I just set them aside. But one day I was in the local bookshop, and I found myself in the C.S. Lewis section. And so I started to browse his other titles, and I came across Surprised by Joy. And I remember turning it over on the back and reading it, that this is the story of his conversion from atheism to faith. And I remember just being puzzled by that. How is that possible? Is that possible? So I bought it. I read it, had absolutely no effect at all at the time. Just, I read it, I said, well, that's very interesting. That's great for you, but that's not happening. So I put it aside. But again, seeds planted that would emerge before too long again. So I was focused mostly on my studies. I went down to London, did some sightseeing there, met a young woman from Sweden while I was there, and ended up going to visit her that winter for 10 days or so. And for a long time, I had really sought validation, I think, in my ways, from my early teens, through relationships with women. And that experience was in Sweden was very intense. It was very painful. And I think for the first time in my life, I really realized this is not where you're going to find ultimate meaning. This is not where you're going to find transcendence. This is not where you're going to find validation of your existence. So it really left me burned out in a very deep way. And I would say even kind of broken. I just realized there has to be more to life than this. But I came back to Scotland, immersed myself in my studies. And I still hostile toward religion. I remember some friends brought me along with them to it must have been a chapel service, an evensong or something, in one of the old historic chapels that the university owned. And I just wanted to crawl out of my skin listening to this beautiful, polyphony and all the rest of it. At the time, I was just not in a good space. I wanted to crawl out of my skin. What I kept thinking about was right outside of the chapel, there was a marker on the ground where Patrick Hamilton, the first martyr of the Scottish Reformation, was burned at the stake at 23 years old. And I kept thinking in my mind as I was listening to this beautiful music, that's what religion does. That is what religion does.
And I was thinking, as an atheist who's, okay, no God, no church, so when you get burned out with the realization that relationships aren't going to, what's left? For you, it was to really jump into the studies so you can push this issue
right
way away from you.
Right. Yeah, I had been reading all about how absurd life is, and from the moment my brother died, I really believed that. There is no point to all this. But in retrospect now, you look back and realize, well, of course, I wasn't living my life as though that were true.
The authenticity of the atheistic.
So, yeah, a lot of strands didn't come together. This is where I was at the time, so.
Well, if you stay busy, you can avoid.
Busy.
If you stay busy,
right.
you can avoid
right.
asking or answering the questions.
And there are plenty of distractions that we can surround ourselves with.
Especially beautiful Scotland, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So I finished my degree, went back to the United States, and actually my experience of the graduate program was very good in many ways, but it also kind of soured me on the idea of an academic career. Once I saw it from the inside, I thought, I don't know if I want to spend my life writing articles and books that only other academics will read. And it's not to denigrate academics in any way, but spend a lot of time in faculty meetings, that kind of thing. There was something about it that just made me think, do I really want to do this? So I went back to the United States, decided to take a little time to think about it, try to find work, which was not easy. Moved back in with my parents, so I was looking for a job, and St. Augustine said that the disordered soul is its own punishment. And that really revealed itself to be true in my life. I really began kind of a downward spiral. I think it started in a way from the experience in Sweden, and then this general feeling of aimless and not really knowing where I was going to go. Do I really want an academic career? Do I not? Where am I going to find work? I really started to suffer anxiety attacks and panic attacks. Terrible, terrible. Anybody who's gone through them knows. It was just awful. Well, I made what I could call the mistake of taking a job. One of my sisters had taken a job teaching art at the local Catholic high school, and they had an opening for a history teacher. So I applied for it. I got it. Given where I was in my life, stepping into a high school and taking on 5 sections of sophomores was not a good idea. That was a disaster waiting to happen, and it turned out to be. I just collapsed within the first 2 weeks and had to resign. I just could not handle it. And so add to everything else this feeling of failure. I had no idea who I was anymore, where my life was headed. And I just fell apart. Well, in God's providence, it happened that at that high school there was a priest, an elderly priest who had just retired from teaching. He was an oblate of St. Francis de Sales. And he, for whatever reason, took a liking to me. He noticed me right away on orientation day. And he came over and we were chatting. And there was something about him that really attracted me. He's just a very jovial personality. I just liked him. We didn't talk about God. I mean, he's of course asked questions about my family background and things like that. But I just liked being around him. So when I resigned the job and everything fell apart, he was the first person I thought of to go talk to. And he had just retired, so he had a lot of time. So I would go over to the rectory and just sit with him for hours. We would talk about history. He had a passion for history. He was very interested in movies, as was I. So we just talked about all kinds of things. Never God, never the Bible, no faith, anything like that. He was prudent enough to know to let me lead that. Well, eventually, finally, I did become so comfortable with him that I started to share with him my history and the existential crisis that I was finding myself in at this stage in my life. And he really, really guided me back. He asked a lot of questions and was very gentle and joyful in his encouragement. And he said, why don't you, I say Mass at a parish in town every Sunday. Why don't you just come and sit in the back and listen? Don't come up for communion, nothing like that. Just sit in the back and listen. And so I did. I went for weeks. And
why don't we pause there?
Yeah.
Well, that's a good place to pause. It sounds like the Holy Spirit's starting to work in your heart at that point through this retired priest. So let's pause there in a second. And we'll come back in just a bit and pick up on John Knutsen's story. Just a bit. Welcome back to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host, and I've interrupted John Knutsen in his story. You're meeting with a retired priest that became your friend when you were teaching. And you were saying that for the longest time you didn't really talk about the faith. You talked about your common interests. As you look back, was that more of an expression of his strategy?
Yes. He was waiting until I was comfortable enough to begin opening up about that. And that was wise, because given who I was and where I was at the time, if he had really come after me strongly with doctrine or anything else, I would have just run the other way. So it really emerged out of the brokenness of my life at the time and was able to go on from there.
And even his invitation to come to the church, but sit in the back and don't come forward.
Yep. Very Salesian approach. So yes, I was going every Sunday then to his Mass in the nearby parish. I was sitting in the back. And at this time, I was also doing a lot of reading from my father's bookshelves, stocked with Chesterton, Ronald Knox, Christopher Dawson, Thomas Merton, you name it. He had a rich library. So I was pulling down all of these books, and I would find myself night after night reading these. Thomas Howard's books were very influential.
Yeah.
I reread Surprised by Joy again, and this time it hit me like a freight train. For whatever reason, the timing was right. So I threw myself into C.S. Lewis's works, read everything I could of his. Chesterton, as I say, too. And I would find myself night after night just dropping the book in my lap and thinking, this makes complete sense. I've been completely wrong about the irrationality of faith and all that. This makes total sense, but I couldn't make the jump personally to faith. Well, the other thing that happened at this time, my mother was coordinating the Perpetual Adoration Chapel at their parish. So she was the one who would get the phone call if someone who had an assigned hour couldn't come for whatever reason. So she would often find herself in a bind, and she would go and take their place many times. She spent a lot of time over there. But sometimes she'd find herself in a bind, and so she'd call on me to go sit over there for an hour. Well, I didn't really want to do this, but, you know, things are starting to happen. I thought, well, okay, I'll go help her out. So sometimes late at night, I would find myself in this adoration chapel, this small little chapel, and I didn't know what to do. I was very uncomfortable, and I would find myself sometimes getting up and pacing back and forth, and eventually I would be talking out loud to the God I said I didn't believe in, you know. So there was an awareness there of the real presence. I never felt that I was alone in that chapel. I couldn't have explained it. I couldn't have described it. I mean, I knew what Catholics believed about it, but I wasn't there yet. But I knew there was a presence. So that happened a lot. And as I say, I was experiencing terrible anxiety and panic attacks. They would usually strike at night. And when they did, I got into the habit of just piling myself into my little pickup truck and driving to the parish. Most of the time there were people in the adoration chapel, so I didn't want to go in there. So I would go into the main church, which was dark, except for the light of candles and emergency exit signs, things like that. But I liked sitting there, and I would just sit there until the anxiety passed. And all I knew at the time was that when I left, I felt better, and that's all that mattered. As I say, anybody who has gone through that knows. Doesn't matter what it is, if it makes you feel better, you'll take it. So I did that a lot. I would go over there a lot. So between all of the reading I was doing, meeting with Father Kelly, and these visits in the dark of night, eventually one night everything just caught up with me, and I just fell to my knees in the middle of the aisle there in the empty church before the altar, and I was just weeping. And I just said out loud, I cannot do this anymore. I need you. I didn't know who you was at that time, really. But something happened. I don't know what it was. There's an opening. There was a surrender of some kind there. And I knew when I walked out of that church that night that I needed to be held accountable for what had just happened. Somebody had to know about this. And so Father Kelly, of course, was the first person I thought of. So it must have been 10 o'clock at night. It was pouring rain. I drove myself over to his rectory across town. I knocked on the door, and he answered. He was a night owl, thankfully. And he later said that when he opened the door, saw me there as a drowned rat standing on his porch at 10 o'clock at night. He said, I knew you'd given up the minute I saw you. So we went into the parlor there, and he heard my confession for a good hour. And that was that. I was back formally in the fold. The trouble was, my conversion in a lot of ways was still here. It was intellectual. I didn't have a relationship with God at this stage.
Had you rejected your atheist positions and replaced them with an acceptance of Christian ideas about God? Was it a both and? Were you there intellectually?
Yeah, it was a both and. It was coming to realize that Christian faith has a deep, rational basis, which is very important to me. But the trouble was, I was a very reluctant and dejected convert. I didn't like what had happened in that church because I had been so formed by the culture from my earliest years that I still had a lot of attachments, a lot of desires, passions that were not in accord with this thing that I was starting to gravitate toward and say that I believed in. And I didn't want to let go of that. I didn't know how to. It's funny, the very things that make you miserable can be the very things you cling to because they're familiar. And you just can't imagine your life without them. So that's where I was. And also because having been formed by the culture as deeply as I was, I had all of the usual difficulties, especially with the moral teachings of the church. I just didn't know what to make of this. And I knew enough to know that if I'm going to be authentic about this, my life has to change. I didn't want to just be ambivalent about it, just show up to Mass on Sunday and be done with it. I knew that my life had to change, and I wanted my life to change. I wanted to be happy. I wanted to be at rest and at peace. But that was going to require a lot of stripping away that I wasn't ready for. So Father Kelly and I talked about this a lot, and he had given me a Bible, which I read cover to cover, and I was continuing to read all these other things from my dad's library. And a real turning point for me was recognizing, wait a minute. Up to now, I've been putting all of these different teachings of the church, especially the moral teachings, on trial. It has to, pass muster with my internal Supreme Court if I'm going to accept it. I thought, well, wait a minute. Maybe the church that's been around thinking about these things for 2,000 years might have something to say. So maybe I'll take the church on her own terms and see what she has to say for herself. That changed everything, because I was able to step back, set all of these difficulties aside, and study the Catechism. Talk to Father Kelly about it. Watch EWTN. Go to talks, things like that. And that's when I realized not only had I been entirely wrong about what the Catholic faith is and teaches, what Catholics believe, it all wove together in this spectacular tapestry. And so that was when my intellectual hesitations, objections, difficulties just one by one just crumbled. But again, the problem was I still hadn't really given myself over. I didn't have a relationship with God. I didn't know what that meant yet. Well, the funny thing was, at this time, while all this was going on, Father Kelly drops the bomb on me that he thinks I might have a call to the priesthood or the religious life. I said, I am flattered, but you are out of your mind. And so he said, well, that's fine. Just thought I would say it. Well, I quickly dismissed it with a laugh, and just, that's the most absurd thing I've ever heard in my life. Well, eventually the thought kept coming back into my mind, and I couldn't get rid of it. I remember going to lunch with my brother one day, and I just said, you're not going to believe what he said. He told me he thinks I might be called to be a priest or religious. And my brother, who was not particularly religious, just looked at me and he said, well, maybe you should look into it. And I thought that was not what I wanted to hear. So I had a moment of, a big moment of decision here, because I was kind of cold on an academic career, but I was not able to find another job, and I really didn't know what else I was going to do. So I said, no, academic career is what I want. I'm really interested in this subject. I want to go. So I got back in touch with St. Andrews, applied to the doctoral program, was accepted, and I was going to go back, and that's what I was going to do. But I had this nagging question of a religious vocation now bouncing around in my head at the same time. Well, providentially, it happened that a very old knee problem that I had had since the 7th grade flared up again. I used to dislocate my knees very easily. And it got to the point where I had to have surgery. The doctor said, it's the only thing that's going to have any chance of making this better for you. And I thought, I'll do that. Put St. Andrews off for a year, have the surgery, and I had 3 months of recovery. So while I was recovering, I read the Lives of the Saints, and I started to write to religious orders around the country just for information. And I was particularly drawn to monastic orders for some reason. And so I found myself with a 5 or 6 month stretch of time before I would have been expected back in Scotland to start the doctorate. And a priest friend of the family said, take that time and go spend time with religious communities. Be around people who have made that choice and they're living it. He said, you need to settle this question before you go off and start a doctorate, which is very wise. So I did. I packed up the car and I set off for I didn't know what. And I had booked stays in monastery guest houses along the way, especially the Trappist monasteries, which I was very drawn to. And I remember the first one I visited was in the Missouri Ozarks, a little abbey called Assumption. I remember pulling off the main road onto the gravel road leading to the monastery and just suddenly having a moment of panic, thinking, what am I doing? I've got myself booked a week in this guest house. I don't know the first thing about monastic life. I don't know what this life is going to be like. But I powered through it. You know, I got myself checked into to my room. It was winter, so the sun set early. It was dark. I made my way to the church for Vespers. It's all dark. I'm sitting there in the back, have no idea what's going to happen or what I'm going to be doing. And then I see these shadowy forms of monks in their habits come quietly into the chapel. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, comes this chant out of the darkness. And I was transported. It wasn't even particularly good singing. These were mostly farmers and ranchers, the monks. But I was just captivated. And I remember when I walked out of the chapel that night, I stepped out onto the porch of the guest house, and I was overwhelmed by a feeling of peace and the presence of God, unlike anything I had ever experienced in my life. It just washed over me, and I thought, I am exactly where I need to be, and God is actually here. He is present personally with me. Now, all my life I'd been very restless, and I had trouble sleeping. It was very, very difficult for me, kind of an insomniac, because my mind was always going, and I was always anxious about something. But that night, my head hit the pillow, and I was out. I don't think I've ever slept so deeply in my life, because I felt safe for the first time in my life. I had some wonderful conversations with one of the elderly monks there. Took long walks talking about faith, and that changed everything for me. So I went on and I spent time in a lot of other communities, and I realized quickly that what I thought had been was a vocational discernment trek to find out whether I'm called to be a priest or a monk or a brother. It wasn't about that at all. It was about going out in the desert and meeting God face to face for the first time in my life, to process everything that had happened to me, where I had been, the choices that I had made in my life, what it now meant to be calling myself a Catholic. The vocational piece was in there too, but it was about something much deeper than that. It was about learning how to pray and making sense of all that had happened to me. And so I had a lot of wonderful conversations and read a great deal in those precious, precious weeks. My two main guides there were St. Augustine. His Confessions just blew me away. I had never read anything like that in my life. I felt that here was a kindred spirit. I felt that I understood him and that he understood me. And here, across 1,600 years, I felt like I was reading my life story in a way. That was deeply impactful. And the other was St. Francis de Sales. Through Father Kelly's influence, I read his Introduction to the Devout Life. That was another one that had a very deep impact on me. So when I came off the road there, I still didn't know whether I was called to be a priest or religious, but it was a very, very rich time.
Had you found Christ yet?
Yes. That's where this started to come down into here. It took a long time still for me to develop what I would call a real relationship with Christ. But that trip was certainly a profound step in that direction. So I decided when I came off the road, I said, no, an academic career is not what I want. So I canceled my place, I gave up my scholarship, and I found a job in Washington, D.C. I moved back there, was confirmed at the age of 30, finally, because I had left before I would have been confirmed. And I dated a little bit, continued discerning. I ended up going to do a live-in observership at a Trappist monastery for 2 months, and then I joined the Dominicans for what turned out to be a year and a half. And I left during my first year of philosophy studies. I even knew during the novitiate year that it really wasn't my calling, but my novice master convinced me to take an extra year and really give that to God. So I did, and I'm glad I did. But it happened that when I left, I decided to stay on in the school and finish my degree in theology. And it happened to be there that I met my wife, who was also, she had been baptized, she was a convert, she'd been baptized in college, also had discerned a monastic vocation. So to find somebody who really understood me on that level too was very precious. So we were married in 2007 at the old Franciscan mission in Carmel, California, over the tomb of St. Junipero Serra. And we taught together in the parish for a long time. And on our honeymoon, we went to Rome. We got special tickets for newlyweds to the papal audience, so we were able to greet Pope Benedict XVI, which was a thrill for me. He's one of my great heroes in the faith to this day. I just love Benedict. So to meet him was a real thrill. But we met with a Dominican friend of ours who is still teaching at the Angelicum there in Rome. We had dinner with him one night, And then we went walking through St. Peter's Square. And I remember looking up at the papal apartments and seeing the light on and thinking, what a different man I am now from the last time I was here in St. Peter's Square as an atheist college student. It made me chuckle, but I really had a deep, very profound sense of gratitude looking up and seeing the successor of Peter there, probably hard at work at his desk or meeting with people. I just felt a deep sense of gratitude for the gift of this faith, and that everything that had gone before in my life had led to this point. Meeting my wife was where I finally did find the rest I had been seeking. All the choices that I had made up to that point led there to her. And so there we are.
And now you're head of evangelization for your diocese, right?
Not head, no.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I'm a lowly coordinator.
Oh, okay. I got you.
But yes, very much involved in the work of evangelization now. Whenever I go out to parishes to give talks about that, and if I talk about my conversion story, I always say it's a classic example of God's sense of humor.
Yeah.
You know, that given where I was, that here I am now doing what I'm doing. But it's an enormous joy to be able to do that full time, to work with parishes, parish staff, just other interested people to get into the mission of evangelization, to share this precious gift that we have, because I didn't know what it was.
Yeah. Well, as you look back now as a coordinator of evangelization, trying to help others pass on their faith, but in reflection on your own journey, what is a parent to do to help their children have a shorter path away from the church than you had? I mean, what, not that I'm asking you to be critical of your folks or anything like that, but what can we do today? Because this atheism is everywhere.
Yeah. Well, what my wife and I are trying to do with our daughter, who's just 4.5 yet, but we're trying to incarnate our faith in every way we can. We want it to be a very familiar and a normal part of her life. And so we talk about it a lot. Yeah. We'll go to the parish and light a candle for some intention. Things like that, I think, go a long way from a young age, but it's no guarantee. I mean, I know parents who did everything right, so to speak.
Yeah.
You know, ultimately the kids have to make their own decision, and they're going to be influenced by a lot of different things. So the best thing they can do, of course, for them is pray for them. I mean, my mother, I think, literally prayed me back in to the church, even as I was attacking her faith, undermining it. But I think that personal example, if the children see that this is the most important thing in your life, and that they're comfortable talking about it, I have to think that will go a long way.
Yeah. And different things work differently for different people.
Absolutely.
So we do use every barrel that we can, you know.
You have to know when to press and when not to.
Yeah, like Father Kelly.
Look for the openings.
But something, as I was thinking about all the books you were reading, from your dad's shelves, Father Kelly's Witness, all the different things in your life, it seemed that an important part of your journey was the catechism. Mm-hmm. That there was something about the catechism that made a difference. Talk about that itself. I mean, you read all kinds of great books, C.S. Lewis, Ronald Knox, but something about the catechism.
Yeah. I had a Protestant friend, actually, when I was going through this whole process, who once asked me with some annoyance, she said, well, have you ever even considered any other church, any other Christian church? Well, I was a budding historian. I was interested in history, and I was probably flippant in telling her what I told her at the time, but I thought, well, no, because I know enough about history to know that we didn't have this multiplicity of churches for a very long time, so I'm going to go to the source. Now, I had been baptized and raised a nominal Catholic, so there was that, but maybe it had been different if I was raised in another tradition. But it was very important to me to know that here was this, you want to know what the faith teaches? There it is. There was a sure guide there. I didn't have to go bouncing around and having discussions with all these Protestant friends of mine who had a lot of very different faiths, beliefs on very fundamental matters. So for me, it was very important to be able to look to the rock of the church.
And I was thinking that I'm a great believer in the Catechism. I strongly encourage, if you haven't read the Catechism, just take a page a day for the rest. The flow of the reasoning is wonderful.
And it's all connected.
Yes. Yeah.
As I say, that's when I really took the time to back up and let the church put me on trial, rather than the other way around, in a sense. That's when I saw all of the interconnectedness of the faith.
We have an email. Paul from Rapid City writes, what are some meaningful ways John thinks are effective in reaching people who are struggling with their faith or just don't see the need for God in their life?
I find it comes down to relationship, ultimately. Friendship. It's the example of Father Kelly in my life.
Yep.
You know, he didn't pursue me with faith. He wasn't threatening me with, eternal punishment or anything like that. We just talked about things that were of mutual interest, and eventually I started to open up and share with him what was going on in my life. I really think evangelization happens fundamentally on that level. It's just one friend talking about life and sharing life with another friend.
And one could see three layers in that. If you're a friend trying to share it, there's the authenticity of your life in connection with the message you're giving them, the words you're using and how you're thinking about that, but as well as the prayer underneath, which you're hoping is going to bring on the gift of grace and faith that's going to be necessary anyway in that person's life. So you have all three of those layers.
Yeah, you can certainly recommend things for them to read. You can bring them to Mass with you. You can be there for whatever those openings might be. But ultimately, you're just interested in their life. And they have to see the faith incarnated in you, though. They have to see that this is something that you're not flippant about. You're not taking casually. This has changed your life, this relationship with this person has changed your life. They have to see that. And that's authenticity again. Yeah.
Another email, Jennifer from Des Moines writes, in today's culture that increasingly hostile to traditional Christian values, morals, and principles, what do you think are some ways you would like regular Catholics in the pew to better engage the culture and share the good news about Jesus Christ and his church?
Oh, is that all? I often think that still most Catholics in the pews today have not really encountered Christ themselves. I think often we approach the faith and going to Mass every Sunday and receiving the sacraments as spiritual consumers, in a way. And we don't really think about taking it outside and into our daily lives. So if we're not doing that, then we're not going to be much of a witness. So the first thing I would say is redouble your efforts at prayer. Find out who Christ is. Have you had what Pope Francis likes to call that 4 o'clock moment, in referring to John's Gospel when he says it was about 4 o'clock when they first encountered Jesus? I love that Pope Francis always asks that. What was your 4 o'clock moment? Well, I've met a lot of Catholics who have been Catholics all their lives who, when pressed on it, have had to admit they've never had one. So you've got to start there. Yeah. And once you do that, once you really develop a strong life of prayer and you begin to study the faith and you learn the faith, you'll find the avenues to take it out into the culture. I think we can easily get overwhelmed by thinking, how am I going to evangelize, the parish or the diocese or the culture? But again, it just starts with relationships. The people you work with, standing around the water cooler. They talk about some TV show or movie they saw, deals with some controversial issue or whatever. There are all kinds of openings that we can take to get in there, and that's how it's going to be transformed.
Yeah, the danger not just of our Catholic faith, but it's true of so many Christian traditions, is that we can pass on the practice of the faith without also passing on why we're doing it.
Right.
So people can get to do the things but not know why, and leaving kind of a void. So when those things are challenged in life, they get pushed aside because there wasn't anything underneath to understand that.
There's a lot of talk in the church today, of course, about the Benedict Option. Lots of books being published about that. Believe me, I have a 4.5-year-old little girl now. I'm sympathetic to this idea of sort of withdrawing, taking a step back and trying to build a very solid Catholic community where you can kind of circle the wagons. But from my formation, I'm a son of St. Dominic, and I tend to prefer what's sometimes called now the Dominic option, which is you got to take it out into the culture. You've got to take it out into the professions and be the witness there, because that's how it's going to be transformed.
Through our lives and
through our lives.
And our prayers.
Yeah.
John, thank you very, very much.
Appreciate the invitation.
For sharing your journey with us, and our prayers are with you as you coordinate evangelization and adult formation there in the Arlington Diocese. God bless you for that.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on this episode of The Journey Home. I do pray that John's journey is an encouragement to you. God bless you. See you again next week.